Jim Miller is remembered as the most prolific contract killer in the Old West, a psychopath who murdered his grandparents at age 8 and went on to kill dozens more. But when you examine the actual court records, newspaper accounts, and testimony preserved in Texas archives, something disturbing emerges. We can't prove he killed his grandparents. What we can prove is somehow worse. Before we continue, if you enjoy deep dives into the Wild West, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more shocking stories tomorrow. Also, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. The legend says Jim Miller killed his grandparents with a shotgun at age 8 in Evont, Texas, sometime in the 1870s. The story claims he faced no consequences because of his age. Some versions add that he killed them because they punished him for torturing animals. This narrative appears in countless books, articles, and documentaries about Old West outlaws. It's repeated so often that most people accept it as historical fact. But when you search Texas court records from the 1870s, newspaper archives from that period, and Coryell County legal documents, this childhood murder isn't documented anywhere. No trial records exist. No contemporary newspaper accounts from the 1870s report it. No coroner's reports. No witness statements. The story first appears in sensationalized publications decades after Miller's death in 1909. What we can actually prove through court records, trial transcripts, and contemporary newspaper accounts is that Jim Miller was a professional contract killer who murdered at least 12 people for pay between the 1880s and 1909. He was tried for murder multiple times in Texas courts and acquitted each time despite strong evidence, protected by corruption and powerful connections. He wore a steel plate under his black coat to protect against bullets. He cultivated a respectable, religious image while murdering for profit. He was eventually lynched by a mob in Ada, Oklahoma, in 1909 after killing a former U.S. Marshal. These facts are documented in trial transcripts preserved in Texas court archives, extensive newspaper coverage from the Ada Evening News and Fort Worth Telegram, witness testimony, and historical photographs. This isn't speculation or legend. This is what the evidence proves. Understanding why the childhood murder legend developed requires examining how true crime mythology works. The documented adult crimes weren't sensational enough for pulp magazines and dime novels. Publishers wanted a born monster, not a professional killer enabled by corrupt systems. So they created an origin story that explained his adult evil through childhood violence. It's more entertaining than examining how frontier legal systems protected professional killers who worked for wealthy interests. The documented reality of Jim Miller is more historically significant than any legend. He represents professional contract killing in the frontier era, the systematic corruption that enabled it, and the complete failure of frontier justice to stop violence that served powerful people. Understanding what we can prove versus what became legend teaches us about how true crime sensationalism obscures important historical patterns. Over the next chapters, we'll examine exactly what court records document, how contract killing actually worked as a business, why Texas courts repeatedly acquitted him, and how the mythology grew to obscure the disturbing truth about frontier justice. Before examining what Jim Miller did, we need to establish who he actually was, based on documented records rather than sensationalized legends. The verifiable biographical information is surprisingly limited, which itself reveals something about frontier record-keeping and how legends fill gaps. Texas census records show James Brown Miller was born in Van Buren, Arkansas in 1861. His family moved to Texas in the early 1870s. Beyond these basic facts documented in the 1870 and 1880 census, his early life is poorly documented. The story about being raised by grandparents after his parents died appears in some accounts, but even this family arrangement isn't clearly established in available records. Miller's first appearance in legal records comes from the 1880s in McCulloch County, Texas. Contemporary newspaper accounts from that period describe him as involved in conflicts between sheep ranchers and cattle ranchers, working as a hired gun rather than someone personally invested in the disputes. This pattern of instrumental violence for pay rather than personal motivation would define his entire documented career. The nickname Deacon Jim came from his carefully cultivated public persona. Multiple newspaper accounts from the 1890s through 1900s describe Miller's unusual appearance and behavior. He dressed exclusively in black formal clothing, resembling a preacher. He attended church services regularly. Contemporary sources note he didn't drink alcohol or use profanity. He maintained an image of stern religious respectability. This wasn't authentic piety. Court testimony from his various trials makes clear he was using respectability as cover for contract killing. The Fort Worth Telegram published interviews with people who knew him, describing how he would attend Sunday services and discuss murder contracts on Monday. The religious image was calculated deception. Physical descriptions from contemporary sources are consistent. Newspaper accounts describe Miller as average height, stocky build, with cold eyes that multiple witnesses noted showed no emotion. A journalist who interviewed him for the Fort Worth Telegram in 1906 wrote that Miller discussed killing men the way most people discuss the weather, with complete absence of feeling. Trial testimony from multiple cases consistently mentioned his lack of emotional response even when accused of murder. Witnesses noted he showed no anxiety, fear, or remorse. The Ada Evening News coverage of his final arrest in 1909 quoted multiple observers describing him as showing no more emotion than a block of wood. The steel plate Miller wore wasn't legend. After his lynching in 1909, the mob discovered it when preparing his body. Newspaper accounts describe it as approximately 12 inches square, worn over his chest and abdomen, providing protection that allowed him to take risks other gunmen couldn't. This physical evidence confirmed what witnesses had reported for years. Miller married Sally Clements in 1891. Marriage records and contemporary accounts show she was the daughter of Manon Clements, a rancher with extensive connections throughout Texas. This marriage gave Miller access to networks of wealthy cattlemen who would become his clients. The marriage appears in legal documents but reveals little about his personal life beyond its strategic value. Understanding Jim, Miller requires understanding that contract killing in frontier Texas wasn't random violence. It was a business with clients, payments, methods, and protection systems. Court testimony from Miller's various trials reveals exactly how this system worked. Trial transcripts preserved in Texas court archives show the pattern. Wealthy ranchers, businessmen, or political figures with disputes would arrange through intermediaries to hire Miller. Direct contact was rare. Middlemen handled negotiations to provide deniability. Payment ranged from several hundred to several $1,000s, depending on the target's prominence and the difficulty of the job. Contemporary newspaper coverage from the 1890s through 1900s documented numerous range wars, land disputes, and business conflicts across Texas and Oklahoma that ended with convenient murders. The Fort Worth Telegram and Dallas Morning News regularly reported on suspicious killings where victims had been involved in disputes with wealthy interests. Many were attributed to Miller, though he was only tried for a fraction. Miller's documented methods showed professional calculation rather than Wild West romanticism. Trial testimony from multiple cases describes his approach. He used shotguns at close range whenever possible because they were more reliably fatal than pistols at the distances frontier gunfights actually occurred. He ambushed targets rather than engaging in face-to-face confrontations. He studied his targets' patterns before striking. He planned escape routes carefully. The religious persona served practical purposes. His church attendance and respectable appearance created alibis. Witnesses testified in various trials that Miller would be seen at Sunday services in one town, then a murder would occur Monday in another location. The alibi of "he couldn't have done it, he was in church" was frequently used by defense attorneys, though travel times between locations made this technically possible. What made Miller, so successful at avoiding conviction, wasn't exceptional skill with weapons. It was the protection system that surrounded him. His clients were wealthy ranchers and businessmen with political connections. Court records show a consistent pattern of evidence suppression, witness intimidation, and jury influence in his trials. Tom Green County Court records from the 1896 Joe Earp murder trial show several jurors had business relationships with Miller's clients. Prosecution witnesses changed testimony or failed to appear. Physical evidence disappeared from court custody. This wasn't exceptional. It was typical of how the system protected hired violence when it served powerful interests. The economics of frontier violence explain why this system existed. Land disputes, water rights, and grazing territory determined wealth and power. Legal resolution was slow and uncertain. Hiring someone to eliminate the problem was faster and often cheaper than years of litigation. The frontier's weak law enforcement and corrupt court systems made contract killing a viable business strategy. Contemporary observers understood this. An 1898 editorial in the Dallas Morning News discussing range wars noted that hired guns have become instruments of business policy protected by the very men who should prosecute them. The system wasn't hidden. It was openly acknowledged as a problem that authorities seemed unable or unwilling to address. Miller operated within this system for roughly 25 years. The documented pattern shows systematic professional killing enabled by corruption, not romantic outlaw behavior. Understanding this matters for honest assessment of frontier justice and how violence served economic interests. Court records and contemporary newspapers document at least 12 murders where evidence directly connects Jim Miller. These aren't legendary attributions. These are cases with trial transcripts, witness testimony, and newspaper coverage establishing his involvement. The Joe Earp murder in 1896 is one of the best documented cases. Court records from Tom Green County show Earp was Miller's brother-in-law through marriage. Property disputes between them were documented in legal filings. On April 1, 1896, Earp was found dead from shotgun wounds. Multiple witnesses placed Miller near the scene with a shotgun shortly before the murder. Miller was tried and acquitted. The trial transcript shows prosecution witnesses testified to seeing Miller with a weapon, documented the property motive, and presented timeline evidence. The jury deliberated briefly and voted to acquit. The San Angelo Standard covered the trial, noting several jurors had business connections to Miller's clients. The Frank Four murder in 1906 followed the documented pattern. Four was a hotel keeper in Lubbock who had disputes with local cattlemen. On February 4, 1906, he was killed by shotgun ambush. The Lubbock Avalanche documented the investigation extensively. Multiple witnesses testified Miller had been in town before the murder. Financial records showed payments from cattlemen to intermediaries. Miller was tried and acquitted despite the evidence. The trial transcript shows witness intimidation, suppressed evidence, and jury influence. The pattern was consistent with his previous acquittals. The Pat Garrett murder on February 29, 1908 in New Mexico represents a probable but not definitively proven Miller killing. Garrett was famous for killing Billy the Kid decades earlier. Contemporary newspaper accounts placed Miller in the area. Witness statements collected by investigators mentioned his name. He was never tried, but modern historical analysis of available evidence considers this likely a Miller contract. The Alan Bobbitt murder on February 27, 1909, in Ada, Oklahoma, would finally lead to Miller's capture. Bobbitt was a former U.S. Marshal and respected community member. Unlike previous murders in Texas where witnesses stayed silent, Ada, citizens came forward with evidence. The Ada Evening News documented the investigation showing witnesses testifying to Miller's presence, financial records showing payments from conspirators, and physical evidence connecting him to the crime. This time, the evidence couldn't be suppressed. The community refused intimidation. Miller and 3 co-conspirators were arrested with overwhelming evidence against them. Examining the documented murders reveals Miller's systematic methodology. Most victims died from shotgun wounds at close range. Most were ambushed rather than confronted. Most murders occurred in locations where Miller had no personal connections. Most happened during disputes involving wealthy clients. The pattern shows professional execution rather than personal violence. Court records also document murders Miller was suspected of, but never tried for. Contemporary newspapers attributed various range war killings, ambush murders, and suspicious deaths to him based on witness, reports, or circumstantial evidence. Without trials, these remain probable but unproven. The documented cases are sufficient to establish Miller as one of the most prolific contract killers in frontier history. 12 confirmed murders over 25 years represents systematic professional killing. The actual number was probably higher, but we can only count what evidence supports. What matters isn't the exact body count, but the pattern. Miller murdered systematically for profit, was repeatedly tried and acquitted through corruption, and operated for decades before a community finally refused to let the legal system protect him. Jim Miller was tried for murder at least 4 times in Texas courts. Each trial had substantial evidence, including witness testimony, physical evidence, and documented motives. Each ended in acquittal. Understanding why requires examining how frontier justice actually worked when defendants had wealth and powerful connections. The 1896 trial for the Joe Earp murder in Tom Green County provides detailed documentation of the pattern. Trial transcripts preserved in Texas archives show the prosecution presented multiple witnesses who saw Miller near the murder scene with a shotgun. They established motive through documented property disputes. They showed Miller had opportunity and means. The defense strategy, documented in the trial transcript, involved attacking witness credibility, presenting alibis that contradicted each other but created confusion, and emphasizing Miller's respectable church-going image. The prosecution's objections to defense tactics were routinely overruled. Defense objections to prosecution evidence were routinely sustained. The San Angelo Standard newspaper coverage noted that several jurors had business relationships with ranchers who employed Miller. The judge allowed the defense to exclude witnesses whose testimony would have strengthened the prosecution case. After brief deliberation, the jury acquitted. The 1904's trial for the James Jarrett murder in Erath County demonstrated even more blatant corruption. Jarrett was killed by shotgun ambush. Multiple witnesses testified Miller was in the area and had been hired to kill Jarrett. Physical evidence connected him to the crime scene. The Fort Worth Telegram covered the trial extensively. Their reporting documented that prosecution witnesses were intimidated before trial. Several changed their testimony between preliminary hearings and trial. Others failed to appear, claiming fear for their safety. One witness who maintained his testimony was found dead weeks after the trial under suspicious circumstances. The jury acquitted after minimal deliberation. The Telegram's coverage noted openly that justice was purchased rather than served, and that the power of wealth protected murder once again. The pattern across all 4 documented trials was consistent. Juries included men with economic ties to Miller's clients. Witnesses faced intimidation that authorities did nothing to prevent. Physical evidence was suppressed, lost, or ruled inadmissible. Defense attorneys received favorable rulings while prosecution objections were denied. Modern legal analysts examining these trial transcripts note the systematic nature of the corruption. This wasn't incompetence or coincidence. It was deliberate manipulation of the legal process to ensure acquittal regardless of evidence. Comparing Miller's trials to other contemporary cases reveals the double standard. Texas court records from the same period show common criminals without wealthy backing convicted on far less evidence. Men accused of horse theft or assault were routinely convicted on witness testimony alone. Miller faced multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and documented motives, yet walked free repeatedly. The difference was power and connections. The frontier legal system theoretically provided equal justice, But practical reality showed it protected violence-serving wealthy interests while punishing crimes against those same interests. This pattern wasn't unique to Miller. Contemporary newspaper accounts document other contract killers operating with similar impunity. The system enabled professional violence for hire because the people hiring were the same people who controlled law enforcement, influenced judges, and could ensure friendly juries. Understanding why Miller avoided conviction for so long requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about frontier justice. Courts didn't fail to convict him through incompetence. They failed because the system was designed to protect power, and Miller's violence served powerful people. On February 27, 1909, Alan Bobbitt was murdered in Ada, Oklahoma. This killing would finally end Jim Miller's career, not through court conviction, but through mob lynching. Understanding why Ada succeeded where Texas courts had failed reveals important truths about frontier justice and community action. Alan Bobbitt was a former U.S. Marshal and respected citizen of Ada. His murder was commissioned by local cattlemen who had business disputes with him. The assassination followed Miller's typical pattern: shotgun ambush, professional execution, planned escape. What was different was the community's response. Unlike Miller's previous murders in Texas, where witnesses stayed silent from intimidation or indifference, Ada citizens immediately came forward with evidence. The Ada Evening News documented the investigation extensively through February and March 1909. Witnesses testified they had seen Miller in town before the murder. Others reported conversations they had overheard about murder contracts. Financial records showed suspicious payments. The community organized to ensure witnesses wouldn't be intimidated. Multiple Ada citizens publicly pledged to testify regardless of threats. The solidarity prevented the witness suppression that had protected Miller in Texas trials. This collective action made conviction possible for the first time. Miller and 3 co-conspirators were arrested in March 1909. Oklahoma court records show prosecutors had lined up dozens of witnesses and substantial physical evidence. For the first time, Miller faced a trial he couldn't escape through acquittal. The evidence was overwhelming, and the community was unified in demanding justice. On April 19, 1909, before trial could proceed, approximately 40 men overpowered the jailers and removed Miller and his 3 co-conspirators from custody. They were taken to a livery barn near the jail and hanged. The Ada Evening News published extensive coverage of the lynching, including interviews with participants who made no attempt to hide their identities. Historical photographs exist showing the 4 bodies hanging in the barn. These photographs, preserved in Oklahoma archives, document the event's reality. The images were published in newspapers across the country, making Miller's death national news. Multiple witnesses reported Miller's last words as, "Let the record show I've killed 51 men." Whether this number was accurate remains unknown, but the statement demonstrates how he viewed murder as professional achievement rather than moral crime. Even facing death, he showed no remorse, only pride in his body count. The lynching succeeded where courts had failed because it bypassed the corruption that had protected Miller for decades. Wealthy clients couldn't influence a mob the way they influenced juries. Intimidation tactics that silenced individual witnesses didn't work against collective community action. The mob took justice into its own hands because they recognized the legal system would fail again. Understanding this requires acknowledging uncomfortable historical truths. Mob lynching was often used to perpetrate racial violence and terrorize communities. It represents extra-legal action that undermines rule of law, but in Miller's case, it occurred because the legal system had proven irreparably corrupt. The Ada community believed, with substantial evidence, that Miller would be acquitted again despite overwhelming proof. They refused to allow the system to fail once more. Their action was illegal, but it reflected recognition that legal channels had been corrupted beyond function when dealing with professional killers working for powerful interests. Miller's lynching marked the end of an era. By 1909, frontier justice was transitioning to more centralized law enforcement. Professional contract killing became harder to sustain as systems improved. Miller's death represented both mob justice and the end of an era when hired killers could operate with near impunity. Jim Miller's reported last words claimed 51 murders. This number has been repeated in countless retellings of his story. But what can we actually document versus what became legend? The distinction matters for understanding both Miller's actual career and how true crime mythology inflates reality. Multiple witnesses at the lynching reported hearing Miller claim 51 kills. The Ada Evening News published this number in their coverage. Other newspapers picked it up. Within days, 51 murders became established as fact in reporting across the country. But even if accurately reported, the claim itself requires examination. Professional killers often inflate their body counts. Reputation had value in Miller's line of work. A higher number meant higher fees and more respect in criminal circles. Even facing death, Miller had incentive to exaggerate. 51 would make him the most prolific contract killer in frontier history by far. Careful examination of court records, contemporary newspapers, and historical documents confirms approximately 12 murders where evidence directly connects Miller. These include the Joe Earp killing, Frank Four murder, Alan Bobbitt assassination, and others where trial transcripts, witness testimony, or physical evidence establish his involvement beyond reasonable doubt. Historians studying Miller's career have identified another 10 to 15 probable murders. These are cases where contemporary newspaper accounts mentioned Miller in connection with killings, witness statements suggested his involvement, or the methods matched his pattern. The Pat Garrett murder falls into this category. Evidence suggests Miller's involvement, but definitive proof is lacking. Beyond the documented and probable cases, many unsolved murders across Texas and Oklahoma were attributed to Miller by later writers without contemporary evidence supporting the attribution. Range war killings, ambush murders, and unexplained deaths were assigned to Miller based on speculation rather than documentation. The body count grew with each retelling. Reaching 51 would require attributing nearly every unsolved murder in Texas and Oklahoma during Miller's active years to him. This seems unlikely, even as a professional killer, operating for 25 years, averaging 2 murders per year while maintaining cover would be extraordinary. What we can reasonably conclude based on documented evidence is that Miller killed between 12 and 25 people. Even at the lower end, this makes him one of the most prolific contract killers in documented frontier history. The confirmed dozen alone establishes the pattern of systematic professional murder. The exact number matters less than what we can prove. 12 documented murders over 25 years shows systematic professional killing enabled by corruption. Whether the actual number was 15, 25, or even 51 doesn't change the historical significance. The pattern is what matters. Why does distinguishing documented murders from legendary attributions matter? Because inflated numbers obscure the real story. The documented cases reveal how frontier legal systems protected professional violence serving wealthy interests. That lesson gets lost when we focus on sensational body counts rather than examining the corruption that enabled even 12 proven murders. Miller's claim of 51 might have been accurate. It might have been exaggeration. We can't know. What we can know is what court records, contemporary newspapers, and witness testimony document. That documented reality is sufficient to establish Miller as a prolific contract killer without requiring unsupported claims. The historical significance isn't whether he killed 12 or 51 people. It's that he killed systematically for profit, was repeatedly acquitted through corruption, and operated for decades before a community finally circumvented the legal system that protected him. That pattern is documented regardless of the exact body count. Was Jim Miller a psychopath in the clinical sense? Contemporary descriptions of his personality and behavior show patterns that modern forensic psychology recognizes as consistent with antisocial personality disorder. But applying modern psychiatric diagnosis to historical figures requires careful analysis of what we can actually document. Contemporary accounts consistently describe Miller's unusual emotional flatness. Trial testimony from multiple cases mentions witnesses noting his complete lack of visible emotion even when accused of murder. The Fort Worth Telegram journalist who interviewed him in 1906 wrote that Miller discussed murder with no more feeling than discussing crop prices, as if killing men was ordinary business requiring no emotional investment. The Ada Evening News coverage of his final arrest in 1909 included multiple observer accounts describing his behavior. He ate normally, slept without apparent anxiety, and showed no fear even when mob violence became likely. Witnesses noted he displayed less emotion than most men show when discussing the weather. This emotional detachment appears consistently across different sources and time periods. Miller's violence was entirely instrumental rather than emotional. Court records show he killed strangers for money with no personal investment in the outcomes. He showed no anger toward victims, no excitement in violence, no remorse afterward. Trial testimony indicates he viewed murder as professional work, requiring efficiency and planning, not emotional engagement. The calculated deception Miller maintained for decades demonstrates sophisticated manipulation. His religious deacon persona wasn't slip of character, but sustained performance. He attended church services, maintained respectable appearance, and cultivated image as devout Christian, while simultaneously operating as professional killer. This level of sustained deception without apparent internal conflict suggests profound disconnect between outward behavior and internal experience. Modern forensic psychologists examining historical accounts of Miller note characteristics matching psychopathy markers: lack of empathy and emotional response, instrumental violence for personal gain, ability to maintain false persona over extended periods, complete absence of remorse or guilt, shallow emotional life, and manipulative behavior all align with antisocial personality disorder diagnostic criteria. However, historians caution against definitive diagnosis. We lack detailed developmental history beyond fragmentary records. We can't conduct psychological evaluation or testing. We have limited documentation of Miller's internal experience beyond observable behavior. What we can say is that documented behavior shows patterns strongly consistent with psychopathy. Distinguishing between frontier cultural violence and individual pathology matters. The frontier era normalized violence in ways modern society doesn't. Many men killed in feuds, range wars, or self-defense without being psychopaths. Cultural context explains much frontier violence. Miller was different. His violence was emotionless, systematic, and completely instrumental. Killed strangers repeatedly for money. He showed no empathy, remorse, or emotional connection to his actions. He maintained calculated deception for decades. This pattern suggests pathology rather than cultural violence. The childhood murder legend, though undocumented, persists partly because it fits modern understanding of psychopathy development. Childhood violence toward family members and animals are risk factors for adult psychopathy. The legend may have developed because people trying to explain Miller's adult behavior created origin story consistent with psychopathy patterns. But we don't need childhood murders to recognize pathology. The documented adult behavior is sufficient. Miller's complete lack of empathy, instrumental violence, emotional detachment, and sustained manipulation over 25 years indicate severe personality disorder, whether or not he killed grandparents as a child. What we can conclude based on documented evidence is that Miller likely had antisocial personality disorder consistent with psychopathy. His behavior patterns match diagnostic criteria. Whether he was born this way or developed it through unknown childhood trauma is unknowable. What's documented about his adult actions is sufficient to establish profound pathology. Contemporary newspaper accounts from April 1909 describe Jim Miller as a professional contract killer who was lynched by an Ada, Oklahoma mob after murdering a former U.S. Marshal. The coverage is relatively factual, focusing on documented crimes, the evidence against him, and the community's response. Within years, that documented story transformed into sensationalized legend that obscured the historical reality. The Ada Evening News, Fort Worth Telegram, and Dallas Morning News coverage from 1909 presents Miller as dangerous professional criminal. They report his career as hired gun, document the Bobbitt murder evidence, mention his claim of 51 kills, and describe the lynching. The tone is investigative journalism. They note his cold personality and religious facade, but don't claim supernatural evil or childhood murders. These contemporary accounts mention his emotionless demeanor and respectable appearance, but present him as product of corrupt frontier systems rather than born monster. The emphasis is on how he operated for decades despite repeated trials, suggesting systemic failure rather than individual exceptionalism. By the 1920s, dime novels and pulp magazines began transforming Miller's story. Publications like True Detective Mysteries and similar sensationalist outlets added dramatic embellishments. The body count increased beyond the documented evidence. The childhood murder story appeared for the first time. His personality became mythologically evil rather than clinically pathological. The Kansas Historical Society and other archives preserve these publications, showing the evolution. Each retelling added details that original 1909 sources never mentioned. Miller transformed from documented contract killer enabled by corruption into legendary psychopath whose evil was inevitable and supernatural. The specific claim of killing grandparents at age 8 first appears in publications from the 1920s. Searching Texas newspapers from the 1870s reveals no contemporary accounts of such murders. No court records document it. No coroner reports exist. The story seems to be retroactive construction designed to explain adult evil through childhood violence. Tracking the story's origins shows it appeared in sensationalist publications that regularly fabricated details for dramatic effect. The tale fits patterns of serial killer mythology development, creating dramatic origin stories that make adult violence seem inevitable rather than examining systems that enabled it. Why did the mythology grow so extensively? The basic documented story was disturbing. Professional killer operating for decades, protected by corruption, finally lynched when legal system failed. But this narrative was uncomfortable because it indicted frontier legal systems and powerful interests rather than individual evil. Adding childhood murders transformed Miller into born monster whose evil was inherent rather than enabled. This was more entertaining and less challenging than examining how frontier courts repeatedly acquitted him despite evidence. The sensationalized version blamed individual pathology rather than systemic corruption. The 51 kills claim, reported but unverified in 1909 accounts, became established fact in later retellings. The possible exaggeration became certain truth. The documented dozen murders seemed insufficient for legendary status, so the number was accepted without scrutiny. Modern books, documentaries, and articles about Miller often perpetuate the sensationalized version. They present childhood murders as documented fact despite absence of evidence. They accept the 51 kills without questioning. They focus on psychopath horror story rather than examining the corruption that enabled professional killing. This mythology obscures historically significant lessons. The documented Miller story reveals how frontier legal systems protected violence serving wealthy interests. That pattern matters for understanding frontier justice. The sensationalized version about born evil child killer is entertaining, but historically meaningless. The evolution from 1909 factual reporting to sensationalized legend demonstrates how true crime mythology develops. Lack of complete documentation creates space for embellishment. Entertainment value drives additions that make better stories than history. Eventually, the mythology overtakes documented reality. Stripping away decades of sensationalized mythology, what does Jim Miller's documented career actually teach us about frontier violence, justice systems, and how legends obscure historical truth? The court records and contemporary accounts reveal patterns more important than any childhood murder legend. Here's what we can document through trial transcripts, newspaper accounts, and historical records. Jim Miller was a professional contract killer who murdered at least 12 people for pay between the 1880s and 1909. He was tried for murder at least 4 times in Texas courts and acquitted each time despite strong evidence. He cultivated a respectable religious image while systematically killing for wealthy clients. He was finally lynched by an Ada, Oklahoma mob in 1909 after the community recognized the legal system would fail to convict him again. These facts are supported by Texas court archives, contemporary newspaper coverage, witness testimony, and historical photographs. The childhood murder at age 8 is undocumented and appears to be later embellishment. The 51 kills claim is unverified, though possible. What does this reveal about frontier violence? Miller represents documented professional contract killing serving economic interests. This wasn't romanticized outlaw behavior, it was systematic murder for hire enabled by corruption. Court records show wealthy ranchers and businessmen hiring killers to resolve disputes was viable business strategy in frontier Texas. Understanding this matters for honest frontier history. The violence wasn't just spontaneous feuds or gunfights. It included organized, calculated murder protected by power structures. Miller wasn't unique. He was typical of how frontier systems enabled professional violence. What does this teach about frontier justice? The repeated acquittals, despite evidence, demonstrate systematic corruption rather than isolated failures. Juries were influenced, witnesses intimidated, evidence suppressed. The legal system protected violence, serving powerful interests while punishing crimes against those interests. This challenges Hollywood mythology about efficient frontier justice. The reality was, courts often failed completely when defendants had wealth and connections. Justice, when it came, often required extra-legal mob action because legal channels were irreparably corrupt. What does this reveal about psychopathy in historical context? Miller's documented behavior shows patterns consistent with antisocial personality disorder. His complete lack of empathy, instrumental violence, emotional detachment, and sustained manipulation indicate severe pathology. We don't need unproven childhood murders to recognize this. The documented adult behavior is sufficient. Why does distinguishing fact from legend matter? The mythological Miller is born evil child killer. The documented Miller is professional killer enabled by corrupt systems. The documented story teaches about systemic failures, corruption, and how power protects violence. The legendary version entertains but obscures these historically significant patterns. The childhood murder legend, though dramatic, misses the point. Whether Miller killed at age 8 is unknowable and ultimately less important than understanding how he killed systematically for 25 years with legal system protection. The system that enabled adult murders is documented and historically significant. Miller's career demonstrates that frontier legal systems often failed to provide justice when violence served wealthy interests. Courts didn't fail through incompetence. They failed because corruption was systematic. Professional killers operated with near impunity when working for powerful clients. The final lesson is about how true crime mythology develops. Lack of complete documentation creates space for embellishment. Entertainment drives additions that obscure historical patterns. Sensational origin stories replace examination of systemic failures. Eventually, mythology overtakes documented reality. Understanding what actually happened based on evidence rather than entertaining ourselves with exaggerated legends teaches us about corruption, power, and how justice systems fail. The documented Miller story matters. The legendary version obscures what we should learn. The evidence exists in Texas court archives, Oklahoma historical records, and contemporary newspapers. The pattern is clear. Professional contract killing was enabled by systematic corruption in frontier legal systems. That's the historically significant truth that sensationalized legends about childhood murders obscure. If learning the documented truth about frontier contract killing changed your perspective on Old West justice, subscribe for more historical analysis that examines court records and contemporary evidence rather than accepting sensationalized legends. Next week, the documented reality of frontier lawmen that proves badge and corruption often went together.